All right, everyone. So I'm Mike Monahan. I'm at the Addison Public Library. And on behalf of our partners at the Arlington Heights, Glenview, and Northbrook Public Libraries, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's installment of our series on 33 and a Third, the Essential Albums. We're happy to have you here tonight with us. I hope that you're going to consider joining us each month, if you haven't already, as we learn about more iconic albums. We're taking advantage of the virtual space that's been created by the pandemic to bring you authors from around the country to discuss their writing and love of these essential albums, from last month's Devo to tonight's James Brown. Up next on Tuesday, October 12th, Geeta Dayal will be talking about Brian Eno's Another Green World. So if you can mark your calendar for that one, I hope to see you, hear from you then. So on to tonight's program. Again, 33 and a Third is a series of short books about popular music. Each book focuses on an iconic individual album that occupies a specific place in music history. In this remarkable book we'll be discussing tonight, Douglas Wolk brings to life an October evening in 1962 at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. So with that, it's my honor to introduce Douglas Wolk, author of James Brown Live at the Apollo. Douglas is a writer, a teacher, and a culture critic in Portland, Oregon. Most recently, he's the author of All the Marvels, A Journey to the End of the Biggest Story Ever Told, coming out on October 12th from Penguin. He also teaches comics history at Portland State University. He's written for newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, Time Magazine, Rolling Stone, and The Believer. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm personally looking forward to this presentation, and I think our audience is too. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. This is fantastic. And thank you to Neil and Michael and everyone else involved with bringing me here. This is a lot of fun. I thought I might mention first how this book, Live at the Apollo, came about, because this is a book I wrote 17 years ago. This is a book from 2004. So it's a strange moment for me because my new book, All the Marvels, is coming out real soon. It's coming out in 19 days. It's October 12th. But so this is, I've written a couple books since then. I wrote a book called Reading Comics. I wrote but did not draw a graphic novel called Judge Dredd Mega City 2, which is mostly about how much I hate LA. But this was the first time I'd written a book. And this came about because Dr. David Barker, who was the person who started the 33 and a Third series, got in touch with me when they were putting it together in 2003 or so, and asked if I would be interested in writing a short book about a specific album. That's a great idea. Interesting thing I found about the 33 and a Third series, it almost seems like more people want to write them than to read them. But he said, what album do you want to do? It's like, okay, if I can do something on any album, it would probably be Wanna Buy a Bridge, the Rough Trade Records 1980 compilation. And he said, do you have anything else? I said, The Land of Thirst by World of Pooh. And he said, do you have anything that anyone has ever actually heard of? Yeah. How about James Brown's Live at the Apollo? Great. So I've been obsessed with James Brown since probably was about like 18 years old. Like in college, like I bought his 30 Greatest Hits album. I was like, what is this? I need to figure this music out. This is amazing, and it's from the past, and it's beyond anything I'd ever heard. And at the end of my first year, beginning of my second year in college, the radio station my college radio station, at the end of each term would have a period where you would program hours and hours and hours on end of a specific musical movement or artist or musician or whatever. And so I proposed 18 hours of James Brown. Yes, I was going to DJ 18 hours of James Brown by myself, which I basically did. I cracked a little bit, but discovered he had enormous amounts of music that he'd produced, especially during the incredible period between like 1960 or so and 1973 or so, where he had roughly 100 consecutive hit chart singles. It's unbelievable. Like no one else has come close to him in American pop music in terms of absolute conquering everything for so long. And his breakthrough record was Live at the Apollo, a live album that was recorded on October 24th, 1962. And I started looking into it, and October 24th, 1962 was really interesting because he was recording at the Apollo Theater in New York, in Harlem, in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment where it's pretty clear that everybody in the audience thought there was a decent chance that they would be dead inside a week. So we're going to do a little scene setting with a newsreel recorded that day, October 24th, 1962. And
good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote.
So you get the general idea of that. I also want to show you a little bit of what some of the headlines looked like at that particular point, because the headlines were shrieking. Soviet challenges U.S. right to blockade. It's the headline of the New York Times. Let's see. You had blockade on at 10 a.m. That was the fleet ordered stop red ships. That was the headline on the Daily News that morning. So this is a fraught moment in American history. What's going on in Harlem that night is that James Brown is in the middle of a week-long stand at the Apollo Theater, actually at the end of a week-long stand at the Apollo Theater, where he's been playing 4 or 5 shows every night. And his show is not just his show, it is a review. There are multiple acts. We're going to run through a little bit of what you would see if you were at the Apollo Theater that night. The first act, believe it or not, was none other than James Brown. His band would come out. They would play a couple songs without him. They might start with Suds, which was an instrumental hit that they had at the time. So the James Brown band plays for a few minutes, and then James Brown joins them on stage. He's playing organ. He might have a microphone. They had a newish hit at the time, which was Mashed Potatoes USA. Mashed Potatoes USA had started as more or less Freddie King's instrumental hit, San Jose. Let's hear. So James Brown and his band had recorded an instrumental version of it called James Brown House Party. And then they recorded it a few months later and retitled it Limbo Jimbo. And as they were finishing up that recording session, apparently, James Brown said, "Hey, can you play that back and give me a vocal mic?" And what came out was this. So it's literally just James Brown reciting the names of all the cities he's going to on tour over the instrumental for a couple minutes. It's a hit. It was number 21 R&B, number 82 pop. So that's the opening act. Then the Valentinos played. The Valentinos were the first secular group that Bobby Womack was in. Bobby Womack and his brothers had been singing gospel for a while. They went secular, recorded some stuff with Sam Cooke as their mentor, recorded a song called Looking for a Love. That would have been their hit at the time. And then the next act was Yvonne Fair. The James Brown Review always had a woman singer who would have a featured spot in the introductions. And the most recent hit at the time, actually, I will show you the ad that ran in Billboard right around that moment. Here we go. Yeah, James Brown, His Famous Flames, an all USA hit, Mashed Potatoes USA, down in very, very tiny type at the bottom. Don't forget, you can make it if you try. It hurts to be in love. Yvonne Fair King, 5687. That was the most recent hit. A little earlier in the year, Yvonne Fair had another hit, which you may find kind of familiar sounding. Yeah, it is the song that became I Got You, I Feel Good a couple years down the line. So Yvonne Fair sings, she has her spot. Freddie King, the guy who wrote San Jose, comes out, plays 3 hits. Maybe he plays San Jose, maybe he plays Hideaway. Solomon Burke, who was at that point under James Brown's wing as a performer, came out, probably sang Cry to Me. Pigmeat Markham, comedian that you don't hear a lot of these days. Here Comes the Judge was his big sort of comedy hit in the 60s. He got known for it later in the decade for performing it on Laugh-In. Pigmeat Markham actually recorded a live album at the Apollo Theater the same week as James Brown did. So there are some recordings from that. But then finally it would be Star Time. And Star Time is when James Brown would come out and do his spot at last. So play a little bit of the introduction to that from this album. We're going to pause it right there because, so I'm not going to read directly from Live at the Apollo tonight, but I got somebody who is. The late amazing singer Sharon Jones, back in 2007, recorded herself reading 3 passages from my Live at the Apollo book. I had no idea she was going to do this. She recorded it for a day trotter session. It popped up in my news feed, and like, Sharon Jones is reading things that I wrote. I have to go lie down now. Anyway, there are recordings, so we're going to hear her reading a little bit of the book right now.
Hi, I'm Sharon Jones of Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, and I'm here to read a few passages or paragraphs from James Brown, Live at the Apollo, back in 1962. So one of the passages I think I'm going to read, a paragraph, is called "The Hardest Working Man in Showbiz." That's how they used to say it back then. Now, here we go. Let me just start here reading. You thought that was just a slogan? Live at the Apollo was at least James Brown's 24th show of that week. Can you imagine that? The Apollo Theater had 4 or sometimes even 5 shows a day, starting with the early afternoon, and the revenue had been playing there since Friday, the 19th. At that point, and through most of the 60s, the James Brown Review was playing around 300 days a year. 300 days a year, 4 or 5 shows a day. No review was too tiny, no drive between gigs that was physically possible to make was too long. This particular leg of their endless tour had started October the 9th at the Rainbow Gardens in Denver, Colorado. They worked their way across Texas. Then they stopped off for a one-off engagement at a gymnasium in Jackson, Mississippi before the Apollo gigs. Imagine that now. Thursday, October the 18th, was eventually spent rehearsing in New York. Trombonist Dickie Wells, a veteran of Count Basie's orchestra, had been brought into the band specifically for the Apollo shows. Traditionally, the outcoming and incoming shows would have a Thursday night rap party at the Palms Cafe, a bar and restaurant down the street from the Apollo, between midnight and 3 a.m. Now, Major Robinson would broadcast over WWRL from the Palm all through the 18th was his final last night there. The show had just closed at the Apollo, had been a gospel review featuring the Soul Stirrers, Sam Cooke's former group, who was still among the biggest stars of gospel, and the Swanee Quintet, friends of Brown from way back then in Augusta, Georgia. After Live at the Apollos was recorded, the Brown Review wandered up and down the East Coast, playing armories, arenas, darting west to play out at the Odd Fellows Hall in Steubenville, Ohio, on October 30th, then spending November in Mid-Atlantic, including 10 days engagement in Baltimore's Royal Theater and Washington, D.C.'s Howard Theater. By modern standards, James Brown tour promotions was pretty hazardous. Can you imagine that? Posters advertising this show would often say, tickets available in the usual places. That means record stores, barbershops, drugstores. The Brown organization tended no promotion shows themselves or promoted them with local DJs. A smart move. Check this out now. The DJs would get part of the take, so they'd plug the show on the air and play James Brown record whenever they could. This was not really considered an ethical problem in those days. Nowadays, it's something different. Okay, King Records used to deduct their payola cost as a declared business expense. Some DJs wanted cash only, Now, Sid Nathan said in 1959, he told them all, if they wanted payola, they'd have to take a check. All right.
I can't get over how great it is to hear her voice. That's the setup. There's the introduction. There's the catalog of hits introducing James Brown. We'll hear just a little bit of that. I think necessary to hear a little of that. How's that? Outstanding. Looks like there's a question. Did she properly cite title and author? Yeah, no. When she was reading it, she introduced it as like reading a few paragraphs from my book, which is how I discovered it. Heart-stopping, amazing. So we don't have the complete recording of the James Brown show from that night, despite the fact that the back cover of Live at the Apollo had a little piece of text by somebody from the record label saying, like, this is the complete performance. No, it's not the complete performance, because we hear the beginning of Shout and Shimmy, which was then James Brown's big chart hit and the song he would have opened the show with. And it's just the beginning, the I Feel All Right bit. That goes into I'll Go Crazy, which is radically sped up from its studio version. And then we go into Try Me. Now, we don't have any video or film of what the Apollo Theater looked like in 1962. What we do have is video of what the Apollo looked like in 1968 when James Brown came back there. Well, not came back there for the first time, because he played there a few times a year. But in 1968, he recorded a TV special called James Brown Man to Man at the Apollo. So we're going to hear Sharon Jones introducing the next song, and then we're going to see James Brown performing it, not at the 1962 show, but at a 1968 show. Just about as good, right? Right.
Here we go. Let's go back to the Apollo. Back at the Apollo, the horns riff at the end of I'll Go Crazy. slows down and slides perfectly into the first words of Try Me. Huh. A flawless key change with no audible cue. The kind of trick James Brown would be pulling off all through the show. That word try is all the girls up front needed to start screaming like a descending herd of locusts. That instance has had to have a relief for James Brown. Please, please, please had been a hit, but it follows up singles with 9 flops in a row. Came out in 1956, 1957, and 1958. Brown lost his original band and his original flames as his name faded to appear on chart after chart. After an October 1957 section, King's Records pretty much gave up recording him. Consider for a moment what might have happened if James Brown had left the music business at the end of his 2.5-year losing streak. Somebody might have put out a retrospective CD in the 90s when all sorts of R&B obscurities were getting reissued. Just won't do right, and the B-side, Messing with the Blues, might even have been played a few times on specialty radio shows.
Another little detail to there's some history in this book. There's some of the Cuban Missile Crisis stuff. There's the ongoing thing of what was going on in terms of the international crisis and just how close the world was coming to nuclear war that particular night. There's also like a little musicological thread trying to dig up what some of the songs that were being played that night were. For example, there's a little musical bridge that you hear at least 3 times on Live at the Apollo. It's like 12 seconds long. They play it really, really fast. It does have a history. Here is a bit of what that history is. It actually started as Bill Doggett instrumental, and Bill Doggett in the 1950s and early 60s had a long string of gigantic instrumental R&B hits, things that you would play on jukeboxes. You wouldn't necessarily hear them on the radio so much, but you'd hear them a lot at jukeboxes. And one of them is this track, Hold It. And so forth. This is what it sounds like as an instrumental bridge on Live at the Apollo. And that's just a little bit of punctuation after every song or so, just like, all right, and now we're going to go on to the next one, whatever the next one is. I get the sense that James Brown's set lists were loosey-goosey to the point of the band just had to know whatever he was going to signal for, watch his hands, be ready to hit those cues, or get fined. He decided what was going to happen next, and it happened next. It was more after Live at the Apollo that what a James Brown set was like got more ritualized. Like there was always going to be a performance of Lost Someone, or after Lost Someone that was replaced by It's a Man's World, which it remained for the next decades on end. There was always going to be a bit of Please, Please, Please. Well, there was always going to be a bit of Please, 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 probably somewhere right at the end. We will get to that. But one song in particular that kept coming up in James Brown's career over and over and over again is a song called Think, which was originally by the Five Royales. Loman Pauling was a fantastic songwriter. They were very much ahead of their time, and this is what they sounded like in the late 1950s. So that's the Five Royales version. This is what it sounded like when James Brown recorded it in 1960. That's the famous Flames doing the hand claps in the background. Bobby Bird, always one of the famous Flames. The other famous Flames tended to shift around a little bit, but they were there. So that's 1962. It becomes a hit. It charts when it's a single taken off Live at the Apollo, more than a year after the album comes out. But it becomes a hit. By this point, Live at the Apollo has made massive inroads into radio, and there were radio stations who, for a while after it came out, would just get requests not to hear a song like, can you play James Brown Live at the Apollo? Can you play the whole album straight through? And so they play it straight through, and maybe they'd play an ad between side 1 and side 2, which is a really weird place to put an ad break, because that's the middle of a song. We'll get to that. 1967, James Brown charts again with Think. This time it's a duet with Vicki Anderson. In 1973, James Brown goes into a recording studio with a bunch of studio musicians and comes up with a new version of Think, which also becomes a big old hit. For his next trick, following the hit he has with Think, James Brown records another hit called Think. It's not just the same song. It's the same backing track with a new vocal, and also becomes a top 20 R&B hit. Yeah. Let's just go straight into Sharon Jones's, one more short reading from Sharon Jones.
Let's talk about the knees of James Brown. Can you imagine James Brown knees? Now y'all listen to this. James Brown does not, as a matter of routine, perform without begging repeatedly. Not being one for half measures, he does not beg without falling on his knees. He fall on his knees half a dozen or so, sometimes in every show, on soft wooden floors like the Apollos, on hard concrete stages, on carpet, on stones, on metal, on earth, 4 or 5 shows a day, 300 days a year. In the early years, 100 or more shows a year. I tell you now, even now that he's in his 70s, 50 years in show business, imagine James Brown fall on his knees for his audience tens of thousands of times, probably hundreds of thousands of times. Imagine the scars, inches of thick on his knees. Oh, James Brown, on the knees of James Brown.
Miss Sharon Jones, ladies and gentlemen, absolutely amazing. So, Lost Someone is the great big ballad that occupies the last 5 minutes of side 1, the first 5 minutes of side 2 of Live at the Apollo. Then there's a medley where he basically blows through 8 or 10 songs, covering 4 decades or so of Black American music. And I go into this at length in the book, but notably, Please, Please, Please is among them. And Please, Please, Please is, of course, like his excuse for his famous cape routine, which you've probably seen. If you haven't seen, you're about to see it. Again, there's no extant film or video recording that I know of James Brown from 1962. There is from 1964 when he was invited to perform on the TAMI show. And we'll watch just a couple of minutes of his absolutely unbelievable performance of Please, Please, Please from that particular gig. No, we're not going to watch that video. We're going to watch this video. That's right. And that's the gimmick. A brilliant gimmick. Fakes a heart attack, falls to his knees. Somebody comes onto the cape, tries to lead him away. He throws off the cape, stomps back to the microphone, sings another verse, repeats this again and again. This became the ritual for his shows. But he's not done yet. After his medley, after Please, 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 one more song, which was another song that had been a hit for him recently. It had been originally, well, it started its life as a couple different strains of a couple different songs that the Duke Ellington Orchestra played. Jimmy Forrest, who is a Chicago guy, saxophonist, combined them into his great big hit, Night Train. So as Jimmy Forrest plays it, it's this kind of slow grooving saxophone, kind of like grindy bump and grind kind of song. James Brown records it, speeds it way up. Then when he's performing it live, by the time he's playing it live at the Apollo, it is much, much, much faster. And by the time he is recording it on the TAMI show, which we'll watch a minute or two of here to wrap up and then take some questions, it goes like this. It goes on. It could go on forever. I could watch that forever, honestly. But that's about all that we're going to have time for. If we're going to have time to take some questions, I'm happy to answer any questions about Live at the Apollo, or about my book about Live at the Apollo, or, in fact, I'm also happy to talk about All of the Marvels, which I'll explain a little bit about. This is my book about what happened when I read all 27,000 Marvel superhero comics published between 1961 and a couple of years ago. So read this 500,000 page epic story as a single story, a single funhouse mirror of what American culture has looked like for the past 60 years. So this is the book that comes out October 12th from Penguin, and I'm happy to take anybody's questions on either or both of those. Did James Brown ever have throat problems? That is a fine question. Not that we know of. His voice was pretty shot by the end of his career, but he always figured out how to use it as a rhythmic instrument. Honestly, I think dehydration was more of a problem for him. There is a legend about how he eventually just had an IV set up backstage because he would lose so many pounds of sweat at every single performance. And performances like the one you just saw, again, this is not like the show he's doing that week. This is the show he's doing 4 or 5 times that night, 6 or 7 nights in a row. How big an influence was he on Michael Jackson? Gigantic influence, obviously. Not necessarily vocally so much as dancing style and showmanship. Absolutely master showman. Mike or Neil or Michael, if you want to come back on and say hi.
Yeah, hi, Douglas. Thanks for that presentation. That was really great. And
thank you so much.
I wish I could watch the full video clips and listen to those full audio tracks of each one of those, but
you know what, you can. I mean,
later.
all those clips are on YouTube. All of the TMI show footage is on YouTube. There's so much stuff. There's one of my absolute favorite performances by him is like the night James Brown saved Boston, the April 1968 performance he did at Boston Garden, which for a long time was only available as a bootleg. Mm-hmm. And I first saw it so I did that radio show, the 18-hour James Brown radio special I mentioned. 5 years later, I was back in Boston, and I went into a record store and was talking with the clerk, and the clerk said, "Wait, I recognize your voice. You're the guy who did that gigantic James Brown special, aren't you? We have something special in the back room." And came out with a videotape of this April 1968 show, which now it's on DVD. Now anybody can see it. But what was his impetus to perform at such an exhausting level? That is, again, a really, really good question. But he obviously felt like he had to prove himself and be the best and stay on top as long as he possibly could. Pushed himself inhumanly hard, pushed his bands inhumanly hard, pushed everyone around him impossibly hard. But made it work. He had spent a lot of his youth in prison. He had met Bobby Bird there. He was referred to in prison as Music Box because he was the guy who was always singing and dancing. He got his start professionally like a little later than you'd think. He was always kind of cagey about how old he was, but he spent a while in correctional facilities and came out and just had to make it, had to keep moving, and discuss how his sense of style even extended to redecorating his hotel rooms. Yeah, he designed all of his stageware too. There's some remarkable outfits that he wore. He was such a demanding performer, he would find or dismiss his musicians if they made a mistake. That is true, and you had to really read his hand cues. If you watch live recordings of him, he's always like signaling his band, like, okay, here's what we're going to do next. And if somebody made a mistake, he'd like flash his hands at like $5. You're getting $5 off. You're getting $10 taken off your paycheck. But then most of his musicians reported like, and then like the next week he'd slip you another 20, make it up to you.
Yeah. So he was obviously the most famous of the Flames, but can you talk about his group?
I mean, they were the Famous Flames before they were James Brown and the Famous Flames. Bobby Bird stayed with him his whole career. Floyd Knox and Floyd Scott and Pendleton Knox, I believe is his name. That the others kind of cycled out because the first single was supposed to be like, this is a single by the Famous Flames, and it came out. It was by James Brown and the Famous Flames, and the writing credits had been split. Like James Brown and Johnny Terry, who's another one of the Flames, like split the writing credit for Please Please Please. That was a major payday for the rest of Johnny Terry's life, and the other two split the writing credit for the B-side. But they were not crazy about being overshadowed by him and eventually being shoved out of the spotlight. But he was the one with like unbelievable star presence. If you could do another mainstream 33 and a third book, what would you choose? Ooh, wow, that is a good question. And a lot of the good ones have been taken already. I will say that there's some astounding books in that series. Like there's maybe my personal favorite might be the Franklin Bruno book about armed forces, which is an alphabetical encyclopedia of the racial politics of that album, and also a narrative. Like it's a remarkable piece of just thought and writing. Franklin is also writing a book that I think is finally coming out sometime next year, which is about the history of the bridge in pop music. And James Brown will clearly figure into that as somebody who not only had bridges in his music, but tended to announce them as bridges, because that was his signal to the band in the recording studio that that's what you're going to play now. Like when I give the signal, you're going to switch to the bridge of the song. A lot of James Brown's recordings, I'm riffing on JB, I hope you don't mind. A lot of James Brown's recordings were very, very, very spontaneously created in the studio. There's a song called Escapism, which was recorded before it was written. It was a rehearsal jam, and the tape was rolling. And then they cut 3 minutes out of the rehearsal jam and put it out as a single, and it was a hit, and then they had to learn how to play it. There's a guy named Ron Lenhoff who is credited with co-writing Sex Machine. Ron Lenhoff is not a musician. He didn't play on that record. He didn't really write the song, but James Brown called him up at 3:30 in the morning and said, I've got a great new song. We need to record it tonight. You need to get up and come down to the recording studio right now and record our new hit. And Ron Lenhoff said, like, it's 3:30 in the morning, Mr. Brown. And apparently James Brown said, like, you get a co-writing credit if you come down to the studio now. Thus, it's co-written by Ron Lenhoff. Royalties forever.
We have a question about Clarence Clemens.
What about Clarence Clemens?
Ronald, what about? We'll give him a moment to see if he has some more follow-up on there.
Yeah.
Can you talk? I was curious when you're talking about the use of his music or use of the song by other artists. Was that something that was unique to him at that time, or is that just a standard in the music industry to use those songs?
I mean, sometimes he would cover other people's songs, and like that was standard. Everybody would cover everybody else's songs. The artists who were performing with him in his review would often like do Motown hits. There's in fact, I brought a little bit of show and tell. We have the James Brown Show live on stage, which is an album from, I believe, 1966. And, Vicki Anderson is doing Don't Mess with Bill, and Baby Lloyd, Lloyd Stallworth, who was another one of the Flames, is doing I Can't Get No Satisfaction, Then we've got this, and the songs would get recycled in his review. This is James Brown Presents His Show of Tomorrow, because after Live at the Apollo, the records were anything that looked like a live album was more likely to sell if it was a James Brown album. That's not quite where the live album as we know it begins. There have been plenty of live albums before then, but the James Brown live album, like that was his, like, this is where I really deliver the goods. I really deliver the goods on stage. Arnold asks, what is his role, Clarence Clemens' role in moving on from the Flames with the E Street Band? How did this happen? I don't know about Clarence Clemens having been with the Flames. That is the thing I do not know about. Sorry. But yeah, the other half of your question, Mike, is using other people's music. And James Brown was known to just take giant chunks of other people's music and sign his own name to them. Shout and Shimmy, which is the song that was recorded at the Apollo gig and didn't appear on the album, is basically Shout by the Isley Brothers with the serial numbers filed off. Later on, he recorded a song called Hot, I Need to Be Loved, 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 which is, he basically told his band, like, play David Bowie's Fame, I'm gonna sing. And it is Fame, like note for note, with different lyrics, different top line, but that's the record it is. There's a certain amount of that happened in the music industry too. If the weird way that music rights work is that for most practical purposes, songs have lyrics and they have a vocal melody. And if you are reproducing those, then you are reproducing the song. And if you are reproducing every other aspect of an arrangement, but not doing those, then it's officially a different song, which is interesting. James Brown knew more than most people will. James Brown forgot on any given day more than most people will ever know about groove. But yes, James Brown video of It's a Man's World with Luciano Pavarotti. Yikes. He did quite a few yikes things. For every great record that he made, there are some cringers that he was involved with, but he would try anything. He would just throw anything at the wall. And every, 6 weeks or so, one of the things that he threw at the wall would be something that would revolutionize music, and suddenly you'd have Cold Sweat or whatever, and every band in America would have to learn how to play it, would have to learn something new. They're cringers all the way. I interviewed him once, briefly, for Rolling Stone in 1999, and one of the questions we were required to ask is, what's been the most important political development of the last 20 years? And I asked him that, and he said, well, the fact that Senator Strom Thurmond's been able to stay afloat. Really? Do you know Strom Thurmond? Have you met him? Oh yeah, he said, I know him well. He's like a grandfather to me. He's the grandfather of all of us. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, because he's been both, but what matters is when the young whippersnappers in Congress start getting out of hand, an old man can walk to him and say, wait a minute, son, it goes this way. Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you for the link to the book. other questions I can answer for people?
Oh, well, thank you, Douglas, very much for your time again. And I think I can speak for everyone in saying that was a really great presentation, and we're glad we got to see and hear it. I have one more question, and I'm curious of what's your favorite era of James Brown?
Ooh, what's my favorite era? Almost certainly the period from 1970 to 1971 so in early 1970, James Brown's band went to him before a show and said, "We want to get paid more." And he fired the entire band that night. And he had a backup band ready. It was a bunch of teenagers from Cincinnati who were called the New Daps. And he called them up and said, "Get on the plane. We're playing the show tonight." Teenagers. One of them was Bootsy Collins. One of them was his brother Catfish Collins.
Wow.
There was no rehearsal. There was his private plane flying these kids in and plug in your instruments, cold sweat, hit it. And they stayed with him for a year. That was the year when they recorded Sex Machine. It's the year when they recorded what's the Superbad. It's the year when they recorded Give It Up or Turn It Loose. Like just one absolutely breathtaking funk record after another for a year. And then after a series of gigs at the Olympia in Paris, where Bootsy had taken so much acid that he thought his bass guitar was turning into a snake, they were gone too, and there was a new band. But that is my favorite era.
All right, great, thanks. I'm partial to that as well. I loved hearing about the Live at the Apollo because I was not as familiar with some of the earlier work from the early 60s and before. So I know I learned a lot. I hope everyone in the audience learned a bunch too. You have something else to say, Douglas?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike and Michael and Neil and everybody at the library system. This was a delight to do. See you on tour, I hope.
All right, yeah, and good luck with the sales of the new book. And everyone, if you're interested in the comic, if you want to find a way to get into the comics, try this. Like, dive in head first.
Excellent.
Again,
Thanks so much.